Hey Breck students, Frank here from AFP, and today we have an exciting topic. I'm going to be doing a little bit of talking about how the Beatles basically revolutionized the recording industry and basically their influence on the way we record music today. But who are the Beatles? The Beatles is a four-man band composed of John Lennon, Paul McCartney, Ringo Starr, and George Harrison. They're from England, from a small town called Liverpool, and their rise to fame began in the early '60s, and they were the sound of an era. They started off. I think their first album ever was "Please Please Me," and if you listen to the music between the years of like 1963 and 1965, you notice that there's like a kind of traditional rock and roll influence in their music. I mean, Paul McCartney was doing covers of Little Richard, and John Lennon was doing music inspired by the likes of the Shirelles and Chuck Berry. So there was a lot of influence from American music on the Beatles. And it's crazy because when you think about stuff like that today, like, a lot of the young artists of today take influence from bands like Oasis or Nirvana, and just like try to carry on like this torch of how a rock band or an artist is like the standard. Well, the Beatles had created the standard of the rock band. You got John Lennon and Paul McCartney as these two amazing songwriters and amazing voices. You got George Harrison, who is an amazing songwriter in himself and an amazing, guitar player. This was like, George Harrison was like, kind of like one of the first popular lead guitarists out of a rock band. Like, it could be argued, like he was just, he was that character. He filled in that character. You got these two powerhouses, and you got George Harrison, and then you got this really animated drummer, Ringo Starr, and they built these characters within their music, and really kind of gave us that. So like I said, between the years of 62, 63 to 65, 66, the Beatles had gone on this search for the newest thing, because they were already famous, and they were going out and they were playing. They came to the United States and they gave us the Beatlemania, and they were playing stadiums, and that was kind of the first time the world had ever seen something like that. The world was like focused on these four boys that were going around and playing shows that were huge. And now let's take a step forward. Let's take that idea even forward and think about like rock and roll bands. Like, when you hear the word rock and roll, so many things. You got iconic Stratocaster, you got stadium. You think of huge. The Beatles kind of paved the way for that thought. At least in my opinion. So, if you've never heard the Beatles, after this conversation, I'd love for you to go out and check them out. Even if you end up not liking them, just give them a listen, because there is a lot of I just feel like there's a lot of insight to what was going on back then, and that could reflect on what's going on now in the music industry. So, one of the big problems with the Beatles as a band was they were doing extraordinarily unique things in the studio, and they couldn't bring those elements to the stage because there was no such thing as a drum machine. There was no such thing. I mean, there was probably things that were, there were probably devices that were like examples of like drum machines and synthesizers at that time, but there was no solidified commercial like sampler. Like, I know that the Mellotron is a keyboard that the Beatles used on a famous song called Strawberry Fields, and it kind of is the pioneer to the sampler, because it's basically each key on the keyboard has a piece of tape with a pre-recorded sound. So, but if you've never seen a Mellotron, the Mellotron is something that is huge and is bulky. It's a bulky machine that, is kind of an in-studio piece of equipment that can't be traveled, that can't travel all over the world and get dinged up, and it's very expensive. So that being said, the Beatles kind of missed out on playing a lot of their hits live. You know, a lot of their famous songs consist of like A Hard Day's Night, Help, Yesterday, a cover of Rock and Roll by Chuck Berry. They even while recording new albums and going out, it's like, imagine you were in a band and you're recording new albums, but you're still playing the songs from the first two albums because those are the only songs you can play live. That was what the Beatles were suffering with. So after the album Revolver, the Beatles went on a hiatus and kind of reconstructing the name and their brand. And Paul McCartney had the idea of kind of taking the idea of these four sweet boys from Liverpool and enhancing it by like offering a experience when you listen to the album. Now, the great things about albums is by default they offer us experience. It's kind of like, it's the same thing as opening a book. It has chapters. The songs are the different chapters of the album. So they started brainstorming to what we know now as an album called Sgt. Pepper. Now, in the 60s, in the early mid 60s, around the time of their fame, there was two very, very important elements that didn't exist. Stereo and, well, this next thing existed, but it was limited. Multi-track recording. So multi-track recording went as far as 4 channels. Imagine you right now, the person watching, wanting to spill out some ideas on your computer, but your computer only allowed you to record 4 tracks on GarageBand. That would be kind of tough, because you'd have to squeeze everything. Either you were playing live on one track and squeezing everything you wanted to get down on that one track onto one actual track, or you were doing drums on one track, vocals on the other. So it would be, because we're talking about only having 4 tracks, so it would be drums on one track, vocals on the second, bass and guitar on the third, and extra percussions on the fourth. It's 4 tracks. And if you wanted to add another track, what would happen is you would have to get rid of one of the 4 that were already there. So a way that the Beatles, in approaching Sgt. Pepper, and if you've never heard Sgt. Pepper, oh my God, please go out and listen to it. It is one of the greatest albums in history. It's up there with Thriller. It is up there with Purple Rain and all those freaking famous albums that you can think of, that you, when you go to Barnes & Nobles and you're flipping through the records, you'll definitely see that album. So basically how the Beatles kind of went about like enhancing, we only have 4 tracks, like how can we go far? They would take the 4 tracks that they had, like let's say they had the skeleton of a song, drums, vocals, guitars, and extra percussions or pianos. They would take that and take another 4-track console and send these 4 tracks to one of the tracks of the other 4-track and kind of stack and keep repeating that. And eventually you will have what sounds like a multi-recorded track. And a perfect example of this is a song called A Day in the Life. It is the last song on the album Sgt. Pepper. And what's beautiful about the way this album is kind of, choreographed is that you got your part 1, which is Sgt. Pepper, and then a bunch of songs in between. And before the last song, A Day in a Life, you have your part 2, which is kind of like your ending. And you basically gone through this whole psychedelic trip, musically, of course. And once you get to the last song, it's just this intimate, beautiful, quiet guitar playing, and John's voice kind of creeps in, and like you're just alone with John Lennon and a guitar and like a click and a piano. But it evolves into something like Like there's a part where there's a 24 bar pause where just orchestra, just orchestra going up the chromatic scale. And the fact that they took their music from a regular, like the idea of a 4-piece rock band, drums, bass, guitar, and 3 vocals, and elevated it to this, adding orchestras, adding harpsichords, adding different types of keyboards, adding different types of wind instruments onto this one song, gave everyone around them, all the other artists around them, like the realization that, wow, the limits are endless, and that song and that album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, defined the era of this, like defined the 60s, defined the summer of love. And the idea of just, with the use of this technology, and remember, it's only 4 tracks. They were only, stacking basically 4 tracks through other, like basically taking 2 different types of 4-track machines and putting them together and stacking the tracks together. They were taking this idea of being limited and just kind of like, if you want to look at it this way, for the people who were watching or computer fans, they were command shift D, like it's duplicating the track. It's like duplicating a set of images. So as we go on, as the Beatles progress, they came out with another album following Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band called Magical Mystery Tour, where they push those techniques even further. And they were experimenting with sounds. They were experimenting with with bending tape and getting a wobble effect. Because another thing that I haven't really stated is that this was all completely done on tape. Nothing that I'm speaking about right now is digital. The digital age hadn't happened. This was all through the use of analog gear. And one of the things that impresses me about the Beatles is they weren't doing this in a space like a recording studio today. They were doing this in an orchestra recording studio in a really big space. If you don't know what Abbey Road is a very famous recording studio that was basically home to the Beatles and many other artists. But the Beatles had kind of given Abbey Road like a name, because not only was, because before the Beatles, Abbey Road was used to record orchestras and record film scores, and also like a rehearsal spot for a bunch of these, big ensembles. When they had came into the studio, none of the people in that studio were rock and roll, recording producers. None of them were pop recording producers. They were just, working on highly sophisticated music. And when the Beatles had came in, it was bringing both the sophistication of classical music and pop together. And the Beatles are highly aware of that, So, if you go back and you listen to albums like Sgt. Pepper and Magical Mystery Tour, you can hear how, like, everything in that era, everything that they were using was being put to their advantage. And when I first heard Magical Mystery Tour, I thought that, well, man, how would you perform all those sounds? How would you, get those things down today? Well, the fact is, they were doing all those sounds by hand. They were taking tape, and I actually watched a documentary recently about Jeff Emmerich's time with recording the Beatles, and he said that, and I probably stated this before, he said that him and George Martin, who was the executive producer of the Beatles at the time, and Jeff Emmerich, amazing guy, who, if you're trying to get into recording engineering, you should definitely read some of his books and check out some of his articles online. He had dealt with a lot of the most famous rock stars in the world, like Pink Floyd and all that, and these two guys would get in trouble by EMI because the recording technology that they were using not only was extremely delicate, but it was highly expensive. And just like any recording, technology that we have today, but it was highly expensive. And the Beatles would achieve their sounds by kind of, in the record company's eyes, by damaging their equipment. Like, like think about it. You're pulling tape out of a tape machine. You're wobbling it. You're kind of like, cutting tape and placing it other places. You're sending it down the hallway. Like, the things that the Beatles were doing were far beyond what Abbey Road was like. With the type of musicians that Abbey Road would come in and deal with, the Beatles were just taking full advantage of the space. So later on in life, or later on in the Beatles' career rather, they released albums like the White Album and Abbey Road and finally Let It Be. And you can kind of see, or rather, you can kind of hear how after Sgt. Pepper and Magical Mystery Tour, they had reached this peak of the way their sound was. Like, they reached this like really sophisticated level of making music that there was, if you were a music critic, I guess one would say like there was kind of a decline in the quality of the way they recorded the music until the year 1968. Abbey Road in 1968 kind of had a what's the word I'm looking for? They basically remodeled the floor and remodeled a lot of the technology in there, and they scooped out a lot of the gear, and they installed stereo consoles that allowed you to hear a signal from your left and right. Oh, sorry. I'm trying to do this with my hands. It's from your left and right. So that basically that was around the time I think the Beatles were recording Abbey Road. If you go to listen to the White Album, Abbey Road, you can hear how, though they took a step back in the way they were producing music, they had more space to make more music. Like, the albums got longer, and they kind of took the more like acoustic route, the more avant-garde route. Even though you would say Sgt. Pepper and Magical Mystery Tour is as avant-garde as it gets, I disagree. Like, I would say the White Album and Abbey Road basically show how through the change in technology there was a change in sound. So I would say that the Beatles went through 2 or 3 different sound changes, especially from when they were early boys and up until Sgt. Pepper, then until, White Album and Abbey Road and Let It Be, because in the ending albums you kind of hear this more rock and roll, more guitar heavy music. Like, a famous song after Magical Mystery Tour would be like Helter Skelter, which was, I guess, would be looked at like as the pioneer of metal music, or the pioneer of hard rock music. And they were basically pushing the limits between recording external sounds and acoustic guitars and vocals. And another thing that I would say the Beatles popularized within their time of being in a band is the doubling effect. And the doubling effect is also known as like a tape echo, something that John Lennon really enjoyed using on his vocals. Both John and Paul, but mostly John Lennon. And you can hear this type of effect on the song Revolution. You can hear this type of effect on the song A Day in a Life. It's when you have a take, let's say you have just a regular vocal take, and you perform the exact same vocal take under it. Now, what tends to happen if you do the exact same vocal take, word for word, syllable for syllable, consonant for consonant, you get a little bit of a phase, and it sounds really enjoyable. It sounded really enjoyable for John Lennon. Like, it kind of made him like create a character around, like a psychedelic character around his voice. And another thing that a lot of people who are going into the recording world and recording themselves. There's a lot of questions that a lot of statements that I get faced with is I don't like my voice. John Lennon was one of the most famous people in the world who did not like his voice, and through the use of that technology, through the use of like, you know, doubling your voice and doubling the tracks, it created like a character for him. It created a characteristic for his voice that nobody else had, I think. Like, though people after him used it and used that same method of recording vocals, nobody kind of achieved it in the way John did. And I think personally it was because of the use of tape and because of the use of just, I guess, the technology of the time. It never really sounded like John Lennon. Like, I've heard people double their vocals, and, you know, another person who is really famous for doubling his vocals and being on point with it is Freddie Mercury. You know, in Bohemian Rhapsody, there's hundreds, and this is after the era of the Beatles, where technology was way more advanced, and, you know, rock and roll was kind of just on top of the world. Artists like Queen would, you know, create these huge sonic landscapes of voices through the use of multi-tracking and having like kind of a self-choir. And that right there is just a perfect example of how, like, you know, the Beatles and what they were doing was kind of inspirational to the rock bands that followed. I mean, like, you know, Queen and a lot of the 80s stuff, you know, especially the 80s stuff, because in the 80s was the development of the digital age, and, you know, they were getting sampling machines, and a lot of the things that artists were doing in the studio, they were bringing to the stage. You know, the Beatles didn't have that in their time. So, just to recap, one of the things that makes the Beatles' music so special to me, and I think to history and how recording, you know, kind of evolved, recording music in general, is how they did so much with what little they had, you know. Yeah, they had the instruments, yeah, they had the guitar amps and all that, but it's like, dude, it's 1963. We're in 2020 now, you know, like, now we don't even need guitar amps. We can just plug in our instruments direct into our interface, and we can replicate, you know, a lot of those sounds. And another thing is, a lot of the gear, which I'm not going to get into too much in this video, a lot of the gear that the Beatles used, developers, the music industry developers, people that design like VSTs and plugins, design their products, their virtual products, excuse me, around the Beatles, around the way and not just the Beatles, but a lot of the like pieces of equipment that the Beatles used in the studio, you have been replicated virtually onto our computer by companies like Waves and other companies that like make, you know, virtual software. So we today can replicate how the Beatles make music through our computers and using their, you know, inspired gear. So that's kind of like, for me, one of the things that this is, now we're talking about like how the Beatles influenced today's, you know, music recording. You know, now when we walk into a studio, you know, you got a huge mixing console with a lot of channels on it, and you got a bunch of like outboard gear that you could use virtual replicas, but, you know, the fact that, you know, we're still bridging the gap between analog and digital, I feel like is solely, you know, because of the way, how good the Beatles albums sounded, and how good, not just the Beatles, like how good Rolling Stones songs and albums came out. It's just the organicness of the way analog music sounds, or analog gear sounds on music, is just, you know, irreplaceable. So today I like to just leave off with saying, if you ever want to gain inspiration from recording music, if you want to like check out like different ways to record music, definitely listen to the Beatles, listen to Pink Floyd, and do some music research on like how Abbey Road, like what kind of engineering went down in Abbey Road, what kind of like a gear they were using, you know. And also, if you're interested, if you kind of have your computer all set up and like you're starting your little home studio, I would say definitely check out Waves Audio. They make really cool virtual plugins that allow you to replicate the inside of Abbey Road through your computer. And I got lucky enough to use some of those things, and I own some of the plugins on my computer, and I can see I can see how like you capture the essence of the Beatles sound through those virtual units. It's pretty crazy how accurate they got it. But on that note, I'm excited to keep talking more about the Beatles. I think this week is going to be a Beatles topic. Tomorrow's going to be a video on how they kind of sang together, and how they created harmony, and why their harmony is so beautiful, and why their lyricism is so unique. I'm really excited to share that topic with you. And then on Thursday, I think I'm going to do a Beatles song. I'm going to teach a really cool Beatles song on guitar. So stay tuned, and thanks for watching. Have a good one.